And I guess I wanted to ask you about also, children and people under 18 and what it does when you prevent them from getting access to hormone therapy. I think there is a misconception around people who are not trans about how just wait till you're older, kind of thing, and or um, don't don't meddle in puberty, kind of just some strict, some hetero blockheaded understandings of what it is to be trans. So what does that mean to prevent or to grant and to give gender affirming care to kids, to young
Yeah.
people under 18?
Yeah. And, I think that there's a lot of people, even people that are more liberally minded, that don't have, the full picture of what it means to transition as a kid, what it means to transition as a teenager, and the importance of, affirmative care and a strong support system around them. And so, several transgender people will end up waiting until they are adults, and that works for some people. But several will start experiencing extensive gender dysphoria in their young childhoods, and this is fairly common. It happens, and whenever a kid younger than puberty transitions, all that is them changing their hair, changing their clothes, and using maybe a different name and pronouns. There's no medical component to it at all. Once that kid gets to the age of puberty, what will usually happen, and I've spoken to many families, is they will have already had quite a psychological support team. They'll have doctors, they're speaking with specialists, and with their care team that they have built up and their plan that they've set out over probably the course of several years, they will eventually start on blockers, puberty blockers, which are reversible. Once they've started on puberty blockers, it will buy them 3 or 4 more years, and they can get into their teenage years. And if somebody has been living as their gender for 5, 6, 10 years, and they've been on blockers, they've been through several years of therapy, then in their mid-teenage years, they will be allowed to start their puberty based on whatever their gender identity is. So, for a trans feminine person taking estrogen, trans masculine person taking testosterone. All of this to say, though, is that the effects, and there have been many studies about this recently, the effects of allowing a transgender teenager to start on gender affirming care are tremendously positive. They are so beneficial to these teens. Their suicidality, which the suicide rate in the trans population is extremely high. It is one of the highest rates of any sort of group of people that exists in the United States, because it is a terrifying experience to know that you are a particular gender and to see your body completely betray that. And so whenever you can give them affirming care, they have found that the suicide rate drops by 73%. It is the most effective thing that, if somebody is transgender, it is the most effective thing you can do to a teenager to reduce their suicide rate. And not only that, 73%. And so they had a study, and this one just made me cry because I realized the implication of it. They had a study where they looked at a large group of transgender youth, and they looked at the ones that were allowed to get on gender affirming care and the ones that were not allowed to get on gender affirming care. It was like 9,000 people total. And they found that in the 4,500 bucket that were not allowed to get on transgender care, there were 600 more suicide attempts. And then I started thinking about that, and it's like, these are people that aren't going to be with us. These are people that literally are gone. And then I started thinking, this is just a sample. This is just a little 9,000 person sample. You think about the hundreds of thousands of transgender youth in America. And this is a large amount of people that that their lives are under threat. And I've seen personally, I've met many transgender kids and many transgender youth, and to see the joy in these people's lives, and to see the happiness and the ability to just grow up and be, just like any other person that they want to be, and to have that agency in their life, it's tremendous. It makes their life, it's life-changing for them.
Yeah. And I wanted to, the person who has a huge role to play, obviously, is our parents. And that can make or break your child, whether you support them or not, and help them explore. two things before we go into parents, because I just wanted to say, like I said, like hetero blockheaded, but I just meant like cis blockheaded, I
Of
think.
course, no, of course.
But then I also wanted to underline what you're saying, which is that puberty blockers do just that. They're not saying you'll never go through puberty ever. It's just a blocker. And so if you're like, this is what I need in this moment, and then whatever becomes clearer to you, you want a complete transition, or you do want to transition or not, that is, that's not a forever block
Right.
on
Right.
your
It's not.
puberty.
It's not.
And actually, just before we talk about parents, I did want to ask about, I'm struck by the language, and you've done such a great job covering this, and like, so thank you and hats off. And I'm just so glad, again, we have folks like yourself. I've heard of gay conversion therapy, and I haven't heard of like the de-transing. I've never heard that phrase before, but in these extremist organizations are like floating the idea of people who want to de-trans, and how there's you want to de-transition, and they float stats like 80 to 90% of trans kids reverse their decision. What is wrong with that stat that they float?
Yeah. So this is very similar. You mentioned the gay conversion therapy stuff, and if you remember, and a lot of the younger people might not remember this, but if you grew up in the 90s and you saw the gay rights movement, you would remember the ex-gay movement, and that was a big deal. How they would parade the ex-gays, the people that I was gay, I'm no longer gay, and because I went through this form of therapy or whatnot. Yep. And we now know that most of those people have actually become, started identifying as gay again. The deal with the 80 to 90% detransition rate that is often cited, and every time it is, I will ping all of the legislators with the papers that show exactly why it's wrong. Is those rates were studied in the 1990s, and anybody that knows anything about transgender history and the acceptance of transgender people in the United States knows that trans youth were not allowed in the 1990s. The first person, I believe, to legally transition as somebody under 18, I believe it was Nicole Maines. If she wasn't the first, she was one of the earliest, and that was in 2003. And that was in, I think it was Vermont or Maine. Mm-hmm. And that was a very famous case. There's a book about it called I Am Nicole. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. But these stats of the 80 to 90% rate were built in a time where transition was impossible. They were also built around essentially calling any gender non-conforming person trans. So these are old guidelines based on 1980s, 1990s guidelines. Those guidelines today, the vast majority of people in those cohorts would not even be considered transgenders. So, for instance, they would consider somebody, a boy who played with dolls, as trans in that sort of study. And so, of course, that person is going to desist. The other thing, though, that is terrifying about the statistic is that if one of the goals that they're trying to pursue right now through a new form of conversion therapy called gender exploratory therapy is to essentially try to, and they're using a name specifically to make it sound good, but here's what they do. They'll take a transgender youth, 11, 12, 13-year-old, and they'll say, we'll give you puberty blockers after we try all these other things, and let's see like if all these other things are the real reason for you being trans. So they'll go to like anxiety, depression, etc. And this sounds perhaps like a good idea, but what they're doing, they will never give you those puberty blockers. They will blame you being trans on everything else. They'll wait 3, 4, 5 years through this gender exploratory therapy, kind of like crisis pregnancy centers, like we had talked about before. Right. And the goal is to get that person far enough into puberty to where they feel like there's just no turning back, and they have to live with their bodies as it is today. And they've gone through lots of depression, lots of trauma, lots of anxiety. And often these people, it's psychologically damaging for them. Many of them will still be in that high suicide rate camp, and others will appear to detransition or desist, and then later on in life decide to transition, in the future.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. So yeah, I mean, I was reading also that like if a man liked to cross dress, he was immediately labeled back in the day as trans, and that was sort of like, right. So the lumping of that 90% is just
Right. The
utter
recent studies,
garbage.
so recent studies have shown that the actual number is between 2 and 6%. And it's really interesting if you look at the National Center for Transgender Equality survey in 2015, they showed that of the 2 to 6% that do detransition,
Mhm.
more than half will retransition in the future. And then of that other less than half, so the 40% of the 2% of those people, that small bucket, the vast majority of those cite lack of family acceptance, lack of social support, lack of, discrimination as their main reason for detransition. So even among the people that do detransition and do detransition permanently, the main reason that it happens, by their own words, is nobody was supporting me. I was being discriminated against. I was facing violence.
Which is effectively the Republican strategy.
Exactly.
I mean, they're fine with that.
They want to return to that. That's the whole point. They want to go back to the 80 to 90% detransition rates because that's how they were in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. It was impossible to transition. In fact, that 10% of people still transitioned based on those guidelines and those timelines should say something, because it was absolutely hostile. You couldn't do it. It was so hard.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to parents, and then we'll close out. But in Ohio recently, and you were live tweeting the discussion over their, HB 454 bill, and a legislator is asking a parent, don't have the parent's name, but asking a parent, like, did you take your kid to therapy? And the parent says yes. And then I immediately pulled my kid, who she like basically misgenders. She's a parent of a trans daughter, keeps on referring to the trans daughter as he, and says, no, I pulled my daughter because the therapist was supporting her too much. So just take a look, because Aaron was live tweeting this earlier.
Madam Chairwoman, and to the representative, I just have a quick question for you. Yes, ma'am. So I wanted to know if you would be able to elaborate on your child's experience with therapy, and then how, because you talked about it a little bit, but I just want a little bit more detail, just, the experience with therapy, and then, how that may have helped your child, come up with the decisioning to not, transition right now. So if you could elaborate on that.
To the chairwoman and the representative. Actually, I pulled him out of therapy because the therapist wanted me to immediately start him on hormones and was affirming and would not explore any of his underlying mental health issues.
So nope, didn't even wait for the therapy to kick in. Just completely pulled the kid out as soon as the therapist was too affirming. Anyway, your reaction.
Yeah. So, and thank you for playing that clip. She later would actually go on to say that she then brought her, I don't know the pronouns, because unfortunately following these people, we can't speak to their kids,
right?
But brought her kid to several other therapists who said the same thing. And so she just decided not to pursue therapy at all. And, watching all of these hearings today and last week, it was extremely sad, because you could see how all of these families were struggling with, or how all these kids are probably struggling with these parents that probably put them through a lot of trauma. And I actually, somebody got in touch with me and found out that their mother had spoken at one of these hearings under an alias, and only found out because of my account.
Wow.
And didn't realize that, that his mother was speaking under an alias, watched it and was furious and was like, this is not true to my experience, and like, this put me through a lot of trauma. And we're not hearing from the kids. We're not hearing from their children. And from everything that I've heard and all the people that I've spoken to, it's really sad.
Yeah. Oh my God, awful. I mean, this is like, I'm just also reminded of the white woman who's like biracial son, she thought is like, got radicalized by critical race theory. And she's like, now he identifies as black. I hate this. It's just like the same awful parenting. But I did want to ask you about like good parenting. Like, how can parents, and how are parents supporting their trans daughters and sons? Like, what does that look like?
I have met so many good parents, and to see good parenting kind of it makes me feel really emotional because, you know, I know that I was never going to be able to transition as a teen, as a youth. And, you know, I've had issues with my own parents in that same respect that a lot of these other kids have had very similar issues. And good parenting. I know parents of trans kids, and they will go to the end of the earth and back for their kids. They will fight for their kids. They will show up to these court hearings. They'll show up to the legislative hearings. They will stand there. They will protest. They will speak whenever allowed. And in terms of taking care of their kid, they are their children's biggest support system. Their kids thrive because of their acceptance, because of their, you know, ability and their willingness to trust the experts, trust their kid, to affirm their kid, to believe their kid, and to give their kid that faith and that time of day. I know a parent that was in Alabama, and in Alabama they just passed this felony ban. And I was in touch with her, and she was terrified. She's like, my daughter is 12. She's going to be, you know, she's on blockers. She's going to eventually start hormone therapy. If this happens, like, she has been living as herself for years, and this will detransition her in school. And, you know, her daughter is thriving. Her daughter is intellectually, emotionally whole and strong. And, you know, she's a computer programmer, and she has friends, and she has activities and sports. And so, you know, I had gotten together a GoFundMe for her, and she's since been able to leave Alabama and go to Massachusetts. And, you know, seeing that this parent literally uprooted her entire life and moved across the country just so that her daughter could live a regular childhood that isn't under threat and under attack by a bunch of legislators.
Yeah. That's huge. And it kind of reminds me of what you said earlier about, like, how there should be resettlement. You know, there should be money available. There should be resources, because not everyone can do that, even if they wanted to provide for their kids. You know, Alabama to Massachusetts, that's it's a lot more expensive, I think, to live in Massachusetts than it is to live in Alabama.
It's a big move.
It's a big move, but that's incredible that you did that work and helped raise that money. Erin, is there anything else we should know, you want to add?
You know, this isn't going to stop. This doesn't stop this year. This doesn't stop, you know, in the off season. It doesn't stop in the off legislative cycle. And there is room for every single person to do something, even if it's small. You know, even if it's just acting in your own state, getting to know your state legislator, your local legislator, and talking about all the things that we've spoken about today. So things like passing safe state laws, passing non-discrimination acts, passing bills that ban discrimination in sports and in schools, passing bills that make your state a safe state for people to flee to. And then if you're even one of those states that have already proposed being a safe state, trying to talk to them about helping these refugees from Texas and Alabama. I think that together we can all talk at the state level. And I really strongly, I want to say that, like, the state level is where all of this is happening right now. And so even if you're ideologically opposed to, like, national elections, and I have issues with national elections right now, our national leaders are failing us tremendously, but, like, play in the states, you know, get to know your legislators, get to know the people that are going to make these laws at the local level. And that's where you can make the biggest impact.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.